This is a story of the search for heaven on earth. It's the tale of the Vienna Woods. This lovely landscape has inspired generations of artists and musicians. It's a forest for people, but also for wildlife. Here the soul can seek solace in the small pleasures of life. Vienna's just next door, and there's a story waiting around every corner. In spite of their gentle beauty, the Vienna Woods are part of the Alps, at their eastern end, where they have dwindled from harsh mountains into rolling hills. This is not a national park, nor even a nature reserve. The Vienna Woods have always been ruthlessly exploited for forestry and hunting. But yet, there is magic among the trees. The magic was created by a sensitive blend of nature and art. About 200 years ago, after the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars, people discovered that nature needn't always be hostile, but could also be delightful, edifying, a source of inspiration. Ferdinand Waldmüller was a patriotic artist who loved nature and held the then revolutionary opinion that it should be precisely observed. Observe it he did, often embroidering reality and creating his own private universe. From then on, other painters, writers and composers chose the Vienna Woods as their muse. They became internationally famous, creating a world of sentiment that lives on to this day. This is historic ground at the junction between East and West. This is where the Romans planted vineyards, where the armies of the West fought the Turks, and where Napoleon stationed his troops. And what about the wildlife? Experts may find rare species here, but most of the animals are quite commonplace. But if we look at it through the eyes of the 19th century romantics, we will discover an enchanting land. A walk in these woods reveals small, apparently unrelated stories which nevertheless combine to reinforce the image of an enchanted forest. On a mid-April morning, the sun glints on dry leaves at the edge of a path. As soon as the buds open in spring, nail-mark moths hatch. They are ancient residents of the Vienna Woods, found only where beech trees grow. A humble caterpillar develops within 30 minutes into a fragile moth. An everyday miracle, but a miracle nonetheless. The female is voluptuous, somewhat on the plump side. She flies only at night, remaining earthbound by day. Her abdominal scent glands emit an erotic perfume to attract and seduce passing males. This male is just getting started. He has to shiver until he's warm enough to fly. Within seconds, he discovers the female's scent, which draws him irresistibly to his destination and his destiny. Once the pair has mated, nature's purpose is fulfilled, and the male has nothing more to achieve in life. In a good year, there are nail-mark moths all over the beech woods in spring, meeting and mating as if in an eternal fairy tale. In the Vienna Woods, the enterprising hiker can find a secluded inn around every corner, a refuge for the world-weary romantic. The Vienna Woods are not a geographic feature in themselves, but an interlude in the otherwise endless landscape of Austrian mountains and lakes. For all that, they have their own identity, full of, call it beauty, call it sentiment, but it's there and it's real. On this large and decorative stage, small dramas are played out, like the annual reappearance of the fire salamanders. In the Vienna Woods, fire salamanders are as common as lions in the Serengeti, but somewhat harder to see. After several months of hibernation, the females wander to the banks of narrow streams under cover of darkness. Having mated the previous year, they are now about to give birth. It's a slow and cautious movement, with occasional quicker passages. As is so often the case, commonplace activities remain hidden from the general view. No one has ever before filmed a female fire salamander releasing her offspring into the water, though they do it every year. Secretly and silently, she gives birth to transparent larvae just 2 centimeters long. Her baby frees itself from its birth membrane. At dead of night, every little rivulet is suddenly full of salamander larvae. By morning, they have already become self-sufficient. They've taken on some colour. They can breathe by means of gills, and they lie in wait for insect larvae, worms and freshwater shrimps. By summer, they will be fully grown fire salamanders. Even into the 20th century, the Vienna Woods were hunting grounds on the outskirts of the city. Some areas still support large populations of wild boar, remnants of a tradition that goes back to the days of the Austrian Empire. In spite of the damage they can do to farmland and gardens, wild boars are valuable in forests. They root out weeds, and as they dig up the soil, they bury seeds, planting new trees. It's not only foresters that benefit, but also the cleaning brigade. In this case, door beetles. In May, it's their turn. They can be found wherever wild boars have left their droppings. To the Egyptians, these humble operatives, the scarabs, were talismen for the journey into the underworld. Their gleaming jewel-like armour belies their humdrum existence. As dung beetles, they excavate the excrement to feed on. They carry it off into underground tunnels, and they lay their eggs on it. As you might expect, scarabs recognize potential breeding places by their smell. In some years, the forest swarms with shimmering blue beetles. There is no end to a dung beetle's troubles. As if digging up dung weren't enough, they're also riddled with mites. The Old English name for them is lousy watchmen. The mites use the beetles as a means of transport and share their diet of dung. They're an endless source of irritation, sometimes driving the beetles to demented antics as they try to rid themselves of their burden of itchy parasites. To the Viennese, wild boar are a familiar sight, while small, slimy animals are often overlooked. In damp meadows where wild boar wallows create small open puddles, amphibians have learnt to live with their rough neighbours. Those who know the puddles of the Vienna Woods will be familiar with yellow-bellied toads. They're the most common amphibians here. The females are prepared to mate for only a few days, so the males are forced to concentrate on the job in hand. Even in the smallest puddles there is fierce rivalry. A brave try, but it didn't meet with much success. Though these are only toads, and their boudoir is a wild boar's wallow, romance is in the air. These are, after all, the Vienna Woods. When it comes to trees, the Vienna Woods are a divided country. To the north, they grow in sandstone. The climate isn't particularly pleasant and the ground is damp, but these are wonderful conditions for a forest of copper beeches, oaks and hornbeams. To the south, the trees are rooted in limestone. The landscape is more hilly, and its light, dry forests consist mainly of Austrian pine. Here, to the south of the Vienna Woods, musicians seem always to have felt very much at home. One of them was Ludwig van Beethoven. In the early 19th century, in the small town of Mödling, he wrote a solemn mass. Being profoundly deaf, he wandered the mountains, ravines and valleys with his manuscript paper, finding his inspiration in the depths of the forest. As he wrote in his diary, "It is as though every tree spoke to me." His Missa Solemnis was created under the influence of this landscape, and Beethoven thought it his greatest work. Beethoven was one of the first to recognize the true significance of the Vienna Woods. They offer a taste of civilized nature, while the city and its amenities are well within reach. A point that is not lost on the wildlife either. Some animals seem to be made for the no-man's land between the city and the wilderness. They live in attics as well as in forests. A good example is the dormouse. Where the half-forgotten property of generations accumulates dust, and especially where food is stored, they lack for nothing. Without doubt, it pays to inspect the attic every night. Who knows what desirable commodities the lord of the manor may have laid on during the day? Most of tonight's nuts are too hard to crack, which creates a major conflict between supply and demand. The quarrel soon ends, though, and the two adopt a common goal. This abundance explains what draws dormice from the open woods into the confines of the attic. On its way to the scene of the crime, one of the accomplices takes a wrong turning. By dawn, the culprits are gone. Vienna and its woods are bathed in soft morning light. Actually, this is the wrong place for a really impressive sunrise, and yet they do happen. Arnold Schoenberg was one of the composers who were influenced by the Vienna Woods. In spring 1900, after a night on the town, he and the Mördling singers climbed a mountain close by and witnessed a sunrise of unearthly beauty. That morning was immortalized in one of his massive cantatas known as the Gurrelieder, in the movement called Behold the Sun. As soon as the temperature rises, the Viennese are drawn to their woods. There's no threatening weather here, no rockfalls, no avalanches, and no storms. The Vienna Woods are not a major challenge to the hiker. They're a friendly place, the most accessible recreational area of the Alps. Though they're just a stone's throw from town, there's a real sense of being in the wild. While the wild boar play in the forest, the inhabitants of the puddles in the meadow are left in peace. Summers are rather uneventful here. The yellow-bellied toads lie idly in the warm water, only occasionally and briefly stirred into action. There's more of interest going on underwater. Since the spring, the toads' tadpoles have changed noticeably. They still feed on algae, pollen and microscopic organisms on the bottom of the pool. Some of them are already developing legs. They're beginning to breathe air. The water in the puddle is running short of oxygen. Soon, it will be time to take to the land. The whole meadow is now suffering from the heat. The wild boar's wallow is abandoned to the sun. Those who can escape ashore. Dragonflies have a particularly elegant escape route. One larva has left the puddle and climbed a slender reed. After a few days, the inevitable happens. The transition from tadpoles to toadlets is complete, just in time. In the forest, water is not in such short supply. The streams still murmur along, much to the benefit of the salamander larvae, which by now are well grown. In the course of the year, they have taken on a touch of the colours that make their parents so conspicuous. Also, their gills are getting smaller and smaller, and just like tadpoles, they too have to come to the surface from time to time for a breath of air. Soon, swimming is too much like hard work. It's time to leave. The deed is done. The Vienna Woods have a new resident. Fire salamanders never travel very far, and they live for more than 30 years. Its green girdle of forest adds dignity and stability to the city of Vienna, as well as guaranteeing the survival of wildlife on its outskirts. More than that, it's been soothing the Viennese soul for centuries. What better place to be in vacant or in pensive mood during the heat of summer than in the shady garden of an inn, inspired by wine and music.
Auf den Wienerwald. Seine Heideln.
The eastern edge of the Vienna Woods, where the Alps rise from the banks of the Danube, is also full of stories. And here, too, the landscape has had a fruitful effect on artists. Over there, just beyond the horizon, is Klosterneuberg. At the dawn of the 20th century, a painter was trained here whose artistic talent was fired by the inspiration of nature. His name was Egon Schiele. In later years he wrote, "In those earliest days it was as though I could hear as well as smell the flowers in the wordless garden and the birds whose bright eyes shone with a pink reflection. I often wept when autumn came." The fact that it has been shaped by man for centuries does not detract from the magical aura of the forest, but it contains contrasts that add to its distinctive character. There are still a few enchanting corners that remain untouched. In the depths of the forest, where trees are still allowed to die of old age, lives one of its most extraordinary insects, a killer, called the ground beetle. If there's one thing it's very good at, it's running. It does it all day long. But when it scents prey, it really runs. Earthworms, other insects, slugs, nothing escapes these beetles. Once they evolved as specialist runners, flying became unimportant to them. Their flight muscles are degenerate, which just at present is no consolation to the earthworm. As a rule, both are overlooked or trodden underfoot. But they too are part of the magical whole that makes up the Vienna Woods, and they're closer to us than we think. Is there a connection between ground beetles and people? The answer, strangely, is yes. It's Sunday morning on the outskirts of the city, and a local man is blowing away the cobwebs of the previous night. He's not alone, but some people show scant regard for public amenities. By Sunday evening, the link becomes apparent. The mysterious connection between the walker and the running beetle is a banana. It's eaten by the ground beetle larvae. As is generally known, bananas don't grow locally. Why they are so readily accepted into the diet of ground beetle larvae is a complete mystery that might repay detailed research. However, one thing is certain: ground beetle larvae enjoy eating banana skins. It may have been autumn when Johann Strauss composed the waltz he called Tales from the Vienna Woods, a piece of music to make anyone impervious to the cold.
Gehen wir heim.
Na komm, jetzt spielen wir noch einen.
Ah.
So the tales from the Vienna Woods run forever in circles. In the confused mass of detail there are countless beginnings and no endings. What remains is an impression, a lasting image of the wonderful world that created and sustains the Viennese soul.